This is section 235. We're going to be graphing quadratic equations. So we're going to graph a quadratic equation and examine the features of a quadratic equation. So here are some of the features. Now I know in the previous lesson we examined turning our graph into graphing form, and then that's our h and our k, and it's a quick way for us to be able to find what our vertex is. But if I just asked you a question, hey, what's the vertex of this quadratic formula? There's actually a quicker formula that you can use, and that's x equals negative b over 2a. So if you just plug in from your, the ax squared plus bx plus c, if you did negative b over 2 times that a number, that actually gives you the x value of the vertex. If you plug it in, so if I plug negative b over 2a into my function, that'll actually give you your y value, which is your k. There's also something called the axis of symmetry. It's the equation x equals h. So if we have our parabola, right, this is our h value. It's this line of symmetry that's created with our parabola. And then also with quadratics, the maximum or the minimum will always be at the vertex. So our first example here says find the vertex and the axis of symmetry, the max and min, etc., the graph of the function. So I'm going to use the whole graphing form. So here's my x squared plus 10x plus 23. I'm going to isolate the 23. Remember, b over 2 squared. So 10 divided by 2 squared, that's 5 squared. I need to add and subtract that 5 squared, which is 25. Now remember, always this part right here, it's always going to factor. So that a times c, 25, factors of 25, 5 and 5, and so that's going to be x plus 5 times x plus 5, which is x plus 5 squared. This minus 25 is still here, that plus 23 is still there. Now if there's a number in front, you have to distribute it. In this case there isn't, so the parenthesis disappears. The minus 25 and the 23 come together, and so now I get this x plus 5 squared minus 2. So that means that my vertex is negative 5, negative 2. Now why is it useful to know what my vertex is there? Well, it's actually going to help us graph it, and we're going to see that in a minute. Now we also said the axis of symmetry is always x equals whatever my h value is. So in this instance my h is negative 5, so my axis of symmetry is going to be negative 5. I know based on my a that my graph is going to be facing upward, and so because it's going to go up, my a is positive, I know that this vertex is going to be a minimum, and so I can also say that it's going to be a minimum of negative 2. So now to graph it, usually it's easier if we start at the vertex, right? I know if I plugged in negative 5, I get negative 2. And then I just need to plug in points around it. So I went to the left of negative 5, which is negative 6 and negative 7. I went to the right of negative 5, which is negative 4 and negative 3. And all you need to do is just plug those values into your function. So if I plugged in negative 4, you get negative 1. If I plugged in negative 3, you get positive 2. Now these always mirror, right? Because on our parabola, the left side and the right side, they always mirror each other. So it makes it a little easier for us to find those points. If you ever plug them in, you can use it to double check. So now we can go through and just start plotting the points. So our first one is negative 5, negative 2, and then negative 4, negative 1, and negative 6, negative 1, and then negative 3, 2, and negative 7, 2, and then I can sketch my parabola. Let's look at another one. So let's isolate the 8. Now if you notice, there's a 1/2. It's x squared over 2. For me to do the b over 2 squared, I got to get rid of that 2 in the denominator, so I'm going to factor out the 1/2. Now if I factor out the 1/2, this now becomes 8x. Now it's kind of weird. You're like, wait a minute, why does it become 8x? Well, let's think about it. If I distribute this back through, I get the x squared over 2. 1/2 times negative 8 is negative 4. And remember, if you ever factor something out, it's like you're dividing by it. So 4 divided by 1/2 is 8. So now I can do the b over 2 squared. So negative 8 divided by 2 squared. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. Negative 4 squared is 16. And so I can add and subtract the 16. This will always factor. And so a times c, I get 16. Factors of 16, 4 and 4. Or in this case, negative 4 and negative 4. That's what's going to add to the negative 8. And so I can factor it. And so I'm going to get 1/2, and then, because this factors into x minus 4 and x minus 4, so that's where I get the x minus 4 squared. So the 1/2 comes down. That becomes x minus 4 squared. Then I have my minus 16, and then I have my plus 8. Now this 1/2 will now distribute to both of those things. So the 1/2 times the x minus 4 squared, that's just 1/2 times x minus 4 squared. 1/2 times negative 16 is negative 8. Negative 8 plus 8 is 0. So there's my function. So therefore my vertex, my h is 4. There's no k, so my k is 0. So my vertex is 4, 0. My axis of symmetry, x equals h, that's going to be x equals 4. And then again, my graph is facing upward. And so if it's facing upward, we know that the vertex is going to be a minimum. And so I'm going to have a minimum of 0. Now to graph it, we create our chart again. I have my vertex, which is 4, 0. Pick numbers to the left, pick numbers to the right. And then you can start plugging in numbers. So if I plug in 5, you're going to get 1/2. If I plugged in 6, you're going to get 2. Now I can mirror it because we know it's symmetric. And so now I can go and start plotting it. So my vertex, which is 0, 4. And then I get 5, 1/2, 3, 1/2, and then 6, 2, and 2, 2. And now I can grab my parabola. And notice, because of that 1/2, that 1/2 is a vertical compression, right? That 1/2 basically pushed down on the graph. And so because it pushed it, it kind of flattened it more and made it look wider because of that. So what did we learn today? We learned how to graph a quadratic function. We reviewed putting everything into graphing form. We examined the axis of symmetry. We examined the vertex of a function. We learned a definition on how to find the vertex quicker. And we looked at the max and minimum of a quadratic function. And so how do you actually find the vertex quicker? The x value will always be negative b over 2a. You should memorize that, maybe even flashcard it. And then if you plug it back in, that's how you get your y value. This does conclude our lesson. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments.